Okay. I'm hoping the mics are on. Can you hear me all? Great. Thank you very much. Right, we'll get going. Thank you, first of all, for all turning out on what was a beautiful evening. I know many of you probably would have preferred to sitting around the barbecue this evening, but it's great that you've all come this evening, and we're very grateful for you. So welcome to the first John Smith Centre event of the university year on the 10th anniversary of the independence referendum, which, as all of you know, falls tomorrow. I think when we announced last month that we were going to hold this event on the referendum, there was maybe not entirely kind of positive response from some people. The common view was, oh God, do we really have to talk about this all over again? After 10 years of talking non-stop about independence and the union, is it not surely time to move on and just put it to bed? And you won't be surprised that came particularly from my side of the fence, I guess you could argue, and from Adam particularly, yes. So let me just quickly explain why we decided to go ahead, because I think it does tell you a little bit about what the John Smith Centre is about. So what the John Smith Centre is about here at the University of Glasgow is we are trying to encourage political participation, to inspire and get people involved in the political process. We do that through internships here at the university, where students get a chance to work with politicians. We research about why it is that people, particularly young people, are and aren't interested in getting involved in the political process. And we try to kind of make the case and show why what we think is a better style of politics. Now, I think one of the kind of issues I think that we're seeing right now is that one of the ways to try and demonstrate that better style of politics is to get people of differing views in a room to talk to each other and to show that kind of curiosity about different perspectives that I think maybe is missing a little bit in modern politics, something that we think John Smith, the founder of our centre, very much embodied that sense of curiosity. And I think there's definitely been the case that lack of curiosity has happened in the referendum debate over the last 10 years. My view is that largely we have talked past each other and not to each other. And so notwithstanding the fact that, yes, we have spoken an awful lot about the independence referendum over the last decade, that's why we decided to go ahead with this event this evening, to bring people together with different perspectives, to try and understand a little bit better about where we all stand. So to be clear, tonight is not about arguing again about the vow or about the Barnett formula or indeed about the optimal currency arrangement. No doubt we'll get into these issues, but it's not really what we're here to talk about this evening. What we, as I say, are trying to do is to discuss and answer some questions. How was it for each other? What do we learn about each other over this last 10 years? And what should we do next? What does a country like Scotland do, which has this disagreement? How should it manage that disagreement, perhaps in a little bit better way? Or should we just shut up about this for a while? And I'm sure there'll be some people here tonight who maybe think that's the case. So to discuss these matters, we've brought together a really interesting panel who have written, thought, spoken copiously about this over the last 10 years. Danny Garavelli is a journalist and commentator who writes for titles as varied as the Herald and the London Review of Books. Jean Freeman is the former Health Secretary for the Scottish Government, amongst many other things. Adam Tompkins, to my right, is the Professor of Public Law here at the University of Glasgow and a former Scottish Conservative MSP. And finally, Jonathan Shafi is an independence campaigner and a columnist for The National. I will chair the discussion this evening, but as somebody, I played an active role in the referendum as well on the pro-UK side of the fence as an advisor both to Conservative and to Labour figures. So I'll offer my opinions and my reflections too. Now, we're all obviously keen to have our say, but we want this evening to be a really genuine discussion. So if you want to have your say, we've got microphones coming around and we'll do our very best to come to you. Indeed, I will make sure that we come to you throughout the evening. I thought we'd try and break this up into 3 bits. We're going to spend a bit of time looking back at the actual campaign itself, just a short bit of time there. Then we're going to examine the last 10 years and what lessons might be drawn from all of that. And then we'll conclude, I think, by looking at the future before finishing up around 8:30. So it's the 17th of September. Let's go back 10 years. I can remember exactly where I was this time 10 years ago. Some bright spark in Better Together had said, we need to drive for the line. We need to campaign throughout the night and demonstrate that we are fighting right to the wire. And what this actually meant in reality was that I had to go pick up this evening Ruth Davidson and Danny Alexander and take them to a goods depot outside Paisley, where one journalist turned up. So we were outnumbering them 3-1. So much for driving to the line. But that was how my referendum ended 10 years ago tonight. Jean, you were coming to the end of a campaign where you and had formed this extraordinary campaign within a campaign, the Women for Independence campaign. Tell us a little bit about that experience and how it began, and what was it that motivated people to get involved?
So Women for Independence began kind of in 2012 when it was announced that there would be a referendum. And there were maybe about 5 of us, I think, who we didn't all know each other. We knew of each other, and we knew of each other through Twitter, which at that point was certainly not nearly as toxic as it is now, was much more discursive. In fact, prior to that, we used to have dinners of people who were on Twitter commenting about politics from different points of view. And we would have dinner and demonstrate, A, you can have a lot of fun, B, you can eat something quite nice, C, you can get a wee bit pissed, and D, you can disagree and still talk to each other. Anyway, the independence referendum was announced, and the kind of 5 women, we were all variously moaning at each other about how, here we go again, this is going to be panel after panel after panel of men, loads of male journalists, telling us all what we think. And in the middle of all of that, we said, well, let's do something about this then. Let's not just moan about it. We're going to have 2 years of this. Can't stand 2 years of it being like that. And we began what became Women for Independence. And the point behind Women for Independence, which actually is very close to what you've just said the John Smith Centre is about, the point behind Women for Independence was for women to come together who were curious about the debate. That was it. You didn't have to have a particular view. You didn't have to support it or oppose it. You were curious about this thing that was going to happen, that you were going to be asked to vote on, and you had loads of questions. So up and down the country, in people's living rooms, in hotel function rooms, in all sorts of places, small and large groups of women began to get together to discuss independence and the idea of independence and voice their concerns, their hopes, their worries, all of that. And the organisation as such, if it can be described as that, was loose. It was very loose. It was driven by those groups. Material was produced, and probably one of the most important bits of material we produced, but too late, was particularly aimed at older women who it suddenly struck us, felt as if we were dismissing everything that they believed they and generations before them had achieved. That it sounded to them, although it wasn't intended, but it sounded to them that we were saying everything that has happened up until now in the United Kingdom is rubbish and we should walk away from it. And that's not what we were wanting to say. So we completely crafted something to try and win their support. And where it was used, it did work, but it was too late in the day. But that's how Women for Independence started, and that's how it continued. And it continued, it's still there today. Lots of women did appear in broadcast and print media, nowhere near as much. And honest to God, it was a hard throw, right, to keep on reminding people that there were women out there who were economists and historians and had opinions and had views, and you should be asking them, as well as the shed loads of men that you kept going to. And even after the referendum, 1,000 women came to Perth to continue to be involved. Mm-hmm. So for me, the independence campaign was all about women for independence, and it was joyous.
Jonathan, joyous is the word Jean ends with. My experience, I was talking about on the radio this today, was that I found it unnerving, unsettling, on the no side of the fence. Couldn't understand why it was that, as I saw it, the kind of clear economic arguments were not being heeded, and as we saw during the short campaign, people instead were moving towards the yes side. I'm interested in your experience of it, and I'm also wondering what you thought at the time of us lot in Better Together.
Well, thinking about it, I had hair, so that was a good start. We were all 10 years younger, so we can all agree that maybe there was some benefit there. But my involvement in independence campaigning was very late on. I only got interested in the national question really in 2012, when it became a reality that there was going to be a referendum, and a number of us felt that there was the possibility of this turning into a movement of movements, that not everything had to go through either the SNP or the official Yes Scotland campaign, but that there was actually space for a left-wing campaign within this. And I remember going to the Radisson Blue without a penny and tried to spruce myself up a bit to look respectable enough to book a venue of that scale. And we sold lots of tickets for it. When 800 people turned up to the first of the Radical Independence conferences. And I remember thinking then that something was happening. This was 2 years out, of course, from the vote itself. And we did some really interesting things. And one of the things that we looked at was the number of people who hadn't voted in recent elections, or the number of people who weren't on the voters' roll. And therefore, there was an opportunity to engage with people in a way that's unlike an election, where it's unlike voting for a political party. Here is a discussion about the future of the country. One of the things I think the Better Together campaign, or people within that campaign, got wrong was that this boiled down to the question of national identity. It boiled down to the question of some feeling of Scottish patriotism. My experience was about class issues, about democracy, about what the future of the country was. And I think that's the basis on which people get involved. And it was a very diverse campaign. We did lots within it. The second of the conferences had 1,200, and typically the largest one took place after we'd lost the referendum, where there was about 3,000 people. But for us, this was bringing a brand of politics into the political mainstream. In terms of what I thought about the opponents in that campaign, I think I was more, got involved in more arguments, or was more a feeling of annoyance is the only way I can put it. Others on the left who couldn't see what we thought we could see, which was the opportunity with independence. But, since the referendum, those people who we had a disagreement with on the left, we now work collaboratively with. We both understand that there are pressing issues for people in Scotland, not least the question of poverty, questions of ownership, again, democratic questions. And so, we work, and I work very, very closely with people who disagreed with our position during the referendum.
I think you both already set out something that was very different about the two campaigns, which is that the kind of yes side carried on, in terms of things afterwards, whereas I think the no side, in our case, we were like, right, we've won, and basically a lot of us were thought, can we just move on to something else now, please? Danny, let me ask you, you as somebody that, alone amongst the panel here, weren't campaigning. You were a journalist at the time, and I think you've written about how you made up your mind very late in the day. I'm just curious how difficult it was for journalists trying to kind of offer a kind of more nuanced, kind of complex, trying to reflect some of the complexity of this issue when you're faced with these two kind of very binary sides.
I don't think it was as difficult 10 years ago to be nuanced and to try and navigate your way through. And I think it was particularly not difficult when you didn't have a side. I genuinely did not decide what I was going to vote, and I didn't know what I was going to vote till quite far through. And so the process of reporting was almost like a way of testing my own ideas and seeing what I did think. So for me, the whole thing was, and also it came at a time in my life when I'd come out of an intense period of motherhood and my professional life was opening up again. So it was really exciting to be out with people. And the thing I remember most was just that feeling of engagement, because I'd been used to doing vox pops and you'd go out and you'd spend an hour trying to find somebody that was informed and bothered enough to have a proper conversation with you. And now, like, every single granny standing at a bus stop or teenager outside Greg's could out debate me. You had to stay on your toes all the time to keep on top of it. And that was like, it was exhilarating. It was like, this is what a democracy should be like. And I think probably the two things about the engagement that I remember the most is, building on what Jean said, is the watching women come from, because at the beginning it was really male-dominated, and I was working in a really still male-dominated environment, and just watching women coming to the fore, and it becoming less about process and more about the issues women were interested in. So there was that on the one hand, and the other was like watching young people, because I had a Devo baby, so my oldest was born just at the a few days before the devolution referendum, and then he was getting to vote for the first time, so he was just turned 17, and just watching him and his pals getting completely, informing themselves, becoming, participating. And he actually, just before the actual vote, he had made this PowerPoint presentation for his no voting grandparents, and he was absolutely. And I can see that might sound toxic, but it wasn't. It was completely joyful. It didn't change their minds. And,
Perhaps.
sorry.
We get it up here.
I can't even remember what he said now.
Better together.
Anyway, it didn't change their minds, but the act of doing it was something that will live with him forever. And that whole generation, I really believe, there's a legacy of that for that generation.
And finally, Adam, where do you stand on the civic and joyous-ometer?
Yeah, so I recognise the independence referendum campaign that Jean, Jonathan and Danny have just described, but it's only half the story, because there was a dark side to the independence referendum campaign as well. And, I felt that I spent a lot of 2014 in particular, and some of the year before, walking through a daily wall of hostility. It was like nothing I've ever experienced before or since. Now, I don't mind being unpopular. I was an elected Conservative in Glasgow, for God's sake. I mean, I'm good at being unpopular, but I've never experienced anything before or since like I experienced in the IndieRef campaign. And that doesn't negate the truth of the things that Jean and Danny and Jonathan have just said. It was empowering for a lot of people. It was inspiring for a lot of people. It was a remarkable moment of mass participatory democracy for the whole nation, but it also had a dark side, and I wouldn't want that part of its history to be forgotten or written out. And that dark side has only darkened in the decade since. Not because the hostility has necessarily got any worse, but because the division of Scotland into camps that not only don't talk to each other, Eddie, but don't want to talk to each other. They pride themselves in their silos and in their smug superiority. It's an absolutely ghastly way of doing politics, actually. So, whilst it's true that, there was lots of grassroots stuff, there was lots of bottom-up stuff, and I'm not being dismissive about that at all, it's also true that in the decade since then, that hasn't been nurtured. It has rather been allowed to grow toxic, really quite toxic. Social media has got something to do with that. The culture war has got something to do with that. Brexit has got something to do with that. But the political parties have also got quite a lot to do with that. So, I had a great time in 2014. I got to meet all sorts of people, including some of the people here who I would never otherwise have got to. I had a good campaign. It was quite fun, but it was nonetheless also a moment of real anxiety about the future of the country, and also a prolonged moment of horrible, toxic hostility. It is, of course, true that the worst thing that happened was that somebody threw an egg at Jim Murphy and missed, right? I mean, it wasn't a violent campaign, and that's not to be taken for granted. I mean, it's not to be taken for granted when you think about Northern Irish politics. It's not to be taken for granted when you think about what's happening in America right now. So it wasn't a violent campaign, but it was a nasty campaign, and it's taken us a long time to heal, I think, from that hostility and that nasty.
I'm gonna bring in some audience members in a minute to ask them about their reflections of the campaign. Just a couple, but while people decide whether they want to raise their hands, tell everybody your Billy Bragg story.
Yeah. So I mean, I can remember a couple of big events. There was one in Lanark. I remember there's one in Stirling. I remember they were billed as debates between Yes Scotland and Better Together, and I was put up by Better Together, and they weren't debates between Yes Scotland and Better Together. They were Yes Scotland rallies. 300 or 350 or 400 people who absolutely fucking hated me, and did not hold back at expressing that hatred in terms. And that was a pretty unpleasant set of evenings, and we all did. But there were just glimmers of light, and there was one I remember. It was in Govan Hill Baths in the south side of Glasgow, and I can't remember who organised it. Janice Galloway, the novelist, was on the panel. Ian McWhirter was chairing it, I think, the former Sunday Herald journalist, and one or two other people were there, including Billy Bragg, and he brought his guitar with him. And that was avowedly a kind of a yes gathering. It was very shortly before the referendum. I'm not quite sure what they were doing there, because they should have been out campaigning, trying to change people's minds who, like Danny, hadn't yet made their minds up. But they were gathered in their kind of like little cocoon of, self-congratulation. And for some reason, they invited me. I have no idea what I was doing there, but I was there. And I said to them, look, everybody in this room has already made up their mind, and I guess I'm the only no voter in the room tonight. That's fine, right? And I understand what's at stake for you that, it's about the future of the country. It's about your identity. I'm passionate about it. Let me just say to you that I feel the same way, right? I know that all you've heard from the official Better Together campaign is fear and the fucking currency. I keep swearing, sorry. And the currency, right? But actually, that's not what it's about for me. I mean, I think we need to get to the bottom of what the currency would be of an independent Scotland. I don't think that's a non-trivial issue, but it was a question of identity for me too. And that dissolved their hostility to me, because I was able to speak to them about the issue on their terms. And it was quite a fun night at the end, because at the end of the night, Billy Bragg and I went out for a curry, which is quite a nice thing to do. But I think he warmed up to me when he picked up his guitar and he said, has anybody got any requests, songs I should sing? And I said, yeah, Power in a Union. I said, and he said, different sort of union, Adam, and refused to play it.
Brilliant. Right. Would anybody like to come in here about their kind of any experience of the referendum, or any comments they've got about what you've just heard from the panel? Gentleman right at the back there. Sorry. Keep going. You need to raise your hand again so that we can see you. We'll just take a couple because I'm really keen to get on to kind of yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. I thought it was coincident, but I was quite fortunate in one way, because I was a politics student at the time, but I was also a member of the Officer Training Corps. So I had a lot of friends that were very left-wing, right, independence, we've got to go, here we go. And I had a lot of other people, will die for the Queen, will literally sacrifice themselves for the United Kingdom. So I was quite fortunate, but I saw a lot of other friends that were very much caught up in the echo chamber, like they just couldn't believe the other side. So it's how, I'm sure, because what we want to get to is an idea where we get the passion, which you've obviously mentioned, but how we balance that doesn't tip over into like, you're the other side, you're against me sort of thing. So just how do we balance that? And I think if we can get that, that's a really good step forward.
Thank you. Brilliant point. Thank you. And anyone else? There's Des. You've got Des McNulty, former Labour MSP. Sorry, Des, I'm outing you. Recently published some reforms.
Thanks very much, Eddie. By 2014, I was working here at Glasgow University and actually putting on various events around the referendum with people from different sides, which was always interesting. It was very difficult to get two sides in a room, so you tend to have one side or the other side speaking at once. But one of the things that I did during the referendum was work with colleagues in politics to look at the traffic on Twitter, and through the miracle of IT and with the help of people in our computing science department at the university, we were able to capture the flow and look at who was speaking to who. So you could actually pick up topics and you could work out what the networks were. We started that, I think, in about November or December, and then mapped it through, looking at the volume of traffic and direction of flow. What was immediately apparent in that period was that the No campaign was a completely top-down, this is what the truth is, and people would tweet onwards. Whereas on the yes side, there are all these interesting, different conversations going on between groups that were self-formed. So in a sense, you could actually see from analysing what was happening on Twitter, the energy and the diversity on the yes side. And disagreements, about tactics, disagreements about what it was all about, picking up what Jonathan said. But there was an awful lot of creativity being created on the yes side by the kind of impetus of the campaign. It wasn't a surprise, when you looked at that, to see that the campaign tightened, to the extent that it did towards the end. There was a whole trajectory of energy going into that. It was very clear from the evidence that we were picking up. And what was interesting as well was the ways in which the different topics shifted. So you could actually work out who was talking about what. You could pick up, keywords, etc. So seeing how the debate shifted from one topic to another as the weeks went by, and as the news media people responding to what they read in the newspapers or saw on the television. So there was a sense in which there was an alternative media going on during the campaign on one side of the debate that wasn't happening on the other side of the debate, presumably because the side of the debate that was being active was very dissatisfied with what was happening in the mainstream media. And I think people like the newspapers and the BBC and others picked that up in the end. They'd actually not been reporting what was happening in that space. And that was a real deficiency, I think, in the way in which the referendum was reported. Thanks.
Great. I think we'll crack on because we are short on time. So what I'm keen to do now is just talk about post-referendum and this culture that has grown up over the last 10 years that Adam kind of alluded to just there, and what I was talking about in my introduction, this culture of talking past each other and not to each other. The sense that we've all grown a little bit too comfortable in our trenches, and that even kind of talking to one another is almost seen as by our own sides as almost like a form of kind of appeasement or betrayal. That how dare you kind of go off and speak to somebody else because you might get tainted by them in some awful way. Jean, am I exaggerating? I'm exaggerating, obviously, but
Yes, you are.
But is there a grain of truth in what I've said? And was that your experience over the time that you were working in government?
So over the 5 years, I think in the Parliament, I saw that increase.
Yeah.
My own personal view is that is a behaviour of children, and I don't really have a lot of time for it. And actually, one of the things that came out from the referendum, folks will remember, is the Smith Commission. And part of what the Smith Commission did was devolve some social security benefits till the day I die. I'll keep saying not all of them, and it should have been, but some social security benefits. And I had the absolute privilege of being the minister responsible for the founding legislation and the founding work to create Social Security Scotland. And the truth of the matter is, if it hadn't been for the work that I was able to do with Adam, the legislation would not be as good as it is today. And so for me, that experience in those early years of me being elected, 2016, 17, the work was collaborative and cooperative. And at the end of it all, that legislation was passed unanimously. So it didn't really matter which party you were in, whether you thought we should be independent or not independent. We got to a place where everyone agreed with legislation that has at its heart human rights. Mm-hmm. So I hold on to that because I think that happened not because I'm special and not because Adam's special or anybody else, but because our intent was to do the best job we could. So yes, there is greater toxicity in the debate, but I think that sits at a level that is not where most people are.
Well, you even managed to work with Matt Hancock during the pandemic.
I did indeed work with Matt Hancock, bless. And that's a whole other, goodness, that's a book, right? If you just
I think you should write it.
Just give me a minute, I'll get to it. So there's something, and I'm not clear in my mind here exactly what I want to say, but if we could have over the course of 2 years, energy and engagement and excitement, accepting Adam's point about the dark side, how have we managed since then to allow the dark side to be dominant and lose the energy and engagement and excitement? And then the third part of what you want to talk about tonight is then the most interesting bit. What do we do then to stop that and change that? Because self-evident, people of all sorts of different views, generations, ages, backgrounds, whatever, are interested in their own future, the future of their children, and the future of their country. And there's lots of ways you can slice and dice that, argue it, lots of different ways in which it can be organised or achieved. But maybe rather than talking about the process of a referendum, a second referendum, yes, no, blah, 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 maybe we talk about the issues and identify where there is common cause, where we can do things with the powers that Scotland currently has, where there are deficiencies in those powers, and what we want to do about that. Accept the deficiencies or try and change it. That's where I'd like us to get to. I don't think we should accept the toxicity wherever it comes from.
Adam, just come back to you, because you said before that people, the two sides don't want to come out of this kind of binary divide. Now, you and I both worked in a past life for a party that did very well, the way that the politics divided over this time.
But that road is run.
And so, but I guess my question is whether, what is the incentives for parties that are, are defined by nationalism and unionism to actually come out of that?
We're at the beginning now of a post-IndyRef era. There isn't going to be another referendum anytime soon. You might think that's a good thing. You might think it's a bad thing. I don't give a shit. It's truth.
Swearing.
It's a fact. It's not going to happen. There is not going to be another independence referendum anytime. You're like the hecklers in Lanark. There isn't going to be another independence referendum anytime soon. And that gives us the opportunity of being able to think about how we can do policy, and then perhaps how we can even do politics in a way that isn't overshadowed by the threat or aspiration of another independence referendum. I think we're at the beginning of that, right? It's taken us 10 years to get over 2014. It's taken us a long time to get to the point where it has become clear for various different legal and political reasons that there isn't going to be a rerun anytime soon. That doesn't mean to say that independence is off the agenda. It doesn't mean to say that the constitutional question is off the agenda. It just means to say that there isn't going to be another referendum anytime soon. I'm not saying any more than that, but I'm not saying any less than that either. And that changes the dynamic. That changes the way in which Scottish politics can happen, both in the Parliament, which is, of course, dominated by parties, and at the grassroots level that Jean and Jonathan in particular, but also Danny to some extent, were talking about earlier. And, as well as being a masochist, I'm also an optimist, right? And I am optimistic that there are enough people in Scotland, some of them are in this room, from both the yes side and the no side, who would like to do exactly what Jean has just sketched out. And that's the Jean Freeman political speech with which I have most in my life agreed. We absolutely...
Is that quite low?
No one party and no one side of the constitutional argument has anything approaching a monopoly on what we need to do to get the economy singing, what we need to do to reform the NHS, which is crumbling, what we need to do to transform hopefully just my children's school and perhaps your children's school as well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? The answers to these questions are not going to be left or right or yes or no or leave or remain. They're going to be successful or unsuccessful, and they're going to be successful only if we can find ways of coming together to talk with each other about trying to drive that kind of agenda forward. That's what Scottish politics should be about.
Okay. Jonathan, I'm just going to add a provocation about my side now, because I think the pro-UK side had to do a lot of opposing over the last 10 years. That was what it was, given the nature of the campaign we were in. But I do think it's kind of almost got too comfortable as a kind of spectator in Scottish politics, because the SNP's in power. Our job was simply to sit there and oppose. And I think there's almost a culture of we are the kind of resistance to this threat of nationalism that we saw. And there hasn't been enough emphasis, in my view, on the pro-UK side of setting out a more kind of positive agenda. So I'd be interested to know what people think about that, that we haven't set forward a plan for how we would govern, how a party of the Union would govern Scotland and how it might change Scotland and change the UK. You've spent a lot of time and you've critiqued a lot of time on the pro-independence side. You've been very kind of forthright about your views about the kind of flaws as you see them in the way the pro-independence movement has evolved over the last year. Just tell us a little bit about that. I should say, Jonathan, you were running a conference at the weekend with 100, 200 and so pro-independence activists on this, and I'm interested in what the mood is at the moment and what the kind of, critique, if you like, is of the way that the independence campaign has run over the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think back to the referendum. I think there was a combination of two things which people on the yes side of the argument felt, particularly those that had just come into political activism. One was agency, that they could do something about the world around them. And the second one was a sense of hope. Right? That this was actually something that would mean some kind of era-defining change and that they could be part of it. And I think the no vote was metabolised in such a way that undermined that spirit. And so, understandably, after losing the referendum, almost regiment-like, a huge chunk of the independence movement, about 100,000 or so, joined the SNP. But they joined the SNP, in my opinion, with, rather than irreverence, a sense of deference. And not just deference to a political party, but that the whole idea of independence became transmitted through not this myriad of groups with lots of different points of view and so on, but one person. And by the way, I think there's too much of the kind of personality politics when it comes to that one person and it comes to the criticisms that might be made. I think it's far more political question. And so over those years, independence, in my opinion, became a very useful tool for the SNP to marshal electoral support, to camouflage some of its domestic failings by pitching this big idea of independence in a referendum. People wanted to experience that sense of agency again. But 10 years on, if you look at some of the programmatic issues around the independence prospectus, they, in my opinion, are possibly even worse than they were during the referendum. Very difficult, in fact impossible, to achieve EU membership if you don't have your own independent currency, for example. And sterlingisation means an indefinite period, according to the official prospectus, where you don't have your own currency. Not to get into too much of the policy detail, but that's one of the kind of consequences, I think, of the lack of debate that existed within the post-2014 movement. I would also say that the texture of the independence movement changed after 2014. I think it did become more nationalist. I think it became less about some of the questions that threw someone like me, about power, about class, about ownership, about all these big, big questions. Now, the question now is, what does that all mean? And I do want to agree with Adam on this point. I think it is useful to have consensus reality around, if nothing else, this one point, that another referendum is not on the agenda, that there are serious problems when it comes to the fragmentation of the independence movement. I don't think you can reconstruct an effective movement through its existing parts as they currently exist. The SNP is where it is. We don't need to go into the detail about that. But that raises a huge question across the political spectrum about what you then do. So what I'm not going to do, as someone who's very firmly on the political left, is to artificially suggest that the national question is the only venue or the only vector through which you can pursue politics. That there are huge questions that face Scotland, that there are pressing matters that are global in consequence, and that there must be real debate across politics about how that happens. But just to conclude on that thought, there is a need, a desperate need, and that's why I think tonight's a useful event, for the public to be involved in that discussion. What we can't have is these kinds of discussions being held at the very top amongst politicians and in the institutions. We need to bring that sense of public debate back. And that was, for me, one of the highlights of 2014. Lots of these yes rallies that we had, they were discussing quite difficult and complex issues. We were discussing economics, we were discussing geopolitics, we were discussing all sorts of different things. And I'd like to see that return to Scotland. I'd like to see, rather than high-tech solutions to democracy, I like low-tech. I like public meetings and people, getting in touch with each other and actually talking. We've seen that social media can't be that platform. So I think we need more like this.
Brilliant. And Danny, just about this relationship between politics and the media. And, sometimes I think those of us in politics are often think, well, we can't say what we think because it'll get, transformed out of all, proportion. How do we kind of allow this debate that we're having this evening to be kind of better managed through the...
So, I agree with Adam that there was toxicity at the beginning, and I think it escalated really quickly afterwards. I think, you saw that happening within the media. And I think the problem is that the media was already depleted at the time of the referendum, but it has become increasingly depleted since then with fresh rounds of redundancies every year. And not unconnected with that, there's also been this shift to clickbait and polarised, the preference of polarised views, because conflict attracts more clicks than harmony does, and polarised positions attract more clicks and consensus. And that's quite hard to navigate, I think, as an individual journalist. You try really hard to keep being nuanced and keep your head there in the game, but it's like a riptide, you feel like you're being sucked under sometimes. So, but I also think that politicians have to take a degree of responsibility, because every time you see a politician attack an individual journalist for something that is really just intense scrutiny, the journalist then becomes more antagonistic, and everything becomes ramped up. It's like a vicious circle that we can't get out of, everybody's on the defensive. And I don't actually think we'll move forward until there's some kind of ceasefire or rapprochement where journalists take a step back and say, well, not every encounter has to be a gotcha moment, and we can play a constructive part in a better future. But also politicians don't keep blaming the media for their own failings and say, effective scrutiny is part of a democracy and we need it.
Did you feel, I wonder whether you felt like this, talking about these kind of, this very binary nature, do you almost feel like you were kind of being, claimed by one or the other, in the sense that you again, this sense of betrayal, that if you don't kind of stand by your side, somehow that was the objective of being a journalist over the last 10 years, rather than actually just trying to see it as you saw.
Well, there's been claimed by your own side, or there's being rejected as the opposite, so you could be a unionist stooge and a cybernat in the very same weekend, that's quite exhausting, to be honest. But there's also a sense that once, because after the referendum, obviously I didn't campaign, but I said I was pro-yes. So at that point then it's almost like people don't believe that journalists can be pro-yes but still critique the SNP or whatever, which I felt I did, especially latterly. I never felt there was a problem in dividing myself from what I would like to see for the country, and then pointing out individual flaws or in policy or whatever. I never found that difficult at all, but other people found it difficult to accept that I could do that.
See, I agree with a lot of that, and I think actually politicians have a huge responsibility here. So I remember during the referendum campaign at one point, there was a demonstration outside the BBC, and I remember watching that on the television and shouting at the television, could you stop doing that and go and talk to people? Because I couldn't see the point of this. And I also thought it was a bit unfair. But, I think politicians do have a huge responsibility to do the media well. And that is accept the criticism, accept the critiques, decide what you think of them, and if you don't agree with them, challenge them back. And then that's a debate. That's a perfectly legitimate debate. But assuming that because a journalist comes from a particular outlet, that they come with the lines to take, if you like, from that outlet, is a foolish place for a journalist to be. But I also think, just on this whole, where are we now? I think it is really interesting, and although I am a member of the SNP, I also think what I'm about to say is encouraging, that if you look at support for independence in all the polls, it hovers somewhere between 48 and 50, plus or minus 1, right? There or thereabouts. The most recent poll had support in the age group 16 to 34 at 60%. Now that's the situation where the SNP's electoral success, i.e. the number of votes it can gather, is reduced. So there is something about support for independence that is not tied to the SNP at all. I personally find that encouraging because I want my country to be independent. But I want my country to be independent in order to do better at all the things that need to be done. That's not to say I don't think we can do better with them just now, but to do better. So it's not actually about identity for me. And I think those polling numbers are a challenge to the political parties who, in their policy position, do not support the idea of independence, because they've got to think then about, well, people voted for you who support independence. What are you going to say, do, be with them? They're your voters too. So there's a challenge to all the political parties here about to what extent are you actually representing where people in Scotland are and what they think. So that percentage of people who support independence, at the same time, it's not front of mind. And that's why I agree with Adam to an extent. We're not about to have a referendum, but I also agree that that question is there, it's live, and it's not going away.
Right, we're gonna get to the next section in a while about where we really get into this question of the future, what next. But I'd be interested in contributions from the audience now as to this section where we talked about, this period, this culture that we've grown up over the last 10 years, talking past each other, not talking to each other, so on and so forth. Yes, the gentleman with the cap over there. You just wait for the microphone to come, if you could.
Good evening, Eddie. Good to see you again. Only met twice, but there we go. And good to see Adam as well. Other panelists, I've never met you before. Yeah, post referendum for me, there's a person in the audience who will know himself, who was a member of Better Together, who got me to join the party that I'm a member of. And so I kind of laid my colours to the mast in 2012, as it were. Post-referendum, didn't really do much for the general election. I was part of Adam's campaign in 2016, of which was quite tough work. I think you'll agree, Adam, but there we go. I got elected in 2017 to the council for the ward of Bayliston. And believe it or not, I found myself then amongst other politicians and actually having to sort of do something else that was not necessarily just speaking to activists, but actually conversing with the people who'd been elected. And whatever you do in politics, you can never ever sort of not kind of just shoo away and go on your own one thing. There has to be a certain amount of compromise, etc. And I found myself actually weirdly becoming quite good friends with a lot of people in there. And in fact, there's only probably a couple who don't really like me. I believe Susan gets a hard deal, actually, to be quite honest with you. I do know her well, and fairly good friends. I also unusually ended up in a relationship with a member, another councillor from a different party, who actually voted yes. So that was quite strange. I did find it did become more and more toxic.
Oh dear.
No, not with the relationship. The relationship was perfectly fine.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay.
We didn't actually talk much politics, believe it or not. But there we go. She's quite a bit socialist.
Sorry.
However, I did find it quite toxic, and what I would probably like it further to do, because I don't think there's going to be another referendum anytime soon, is just to actually get on with the part of actually dealing with things. Yeah. As opposed to just talking about, because I think that it's one side is just bang independence, bang, union, and that's it. We've actually got to actually govern ourselves first.
Great, thank you very much. Do you have any women who would like to have a comment? Yes, Esther. So sorry, and both. Yeah, well, actually, so could you just maybe introduce yourself? Yeah, you can.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Esther Robertson here. not really talking about the referendum, but Danny made me think of something going back to 97 and the creation of the Parliament and the role of the media. And one of the things that those of us that had been involved in that campaign realised very quickly was that Scotland had no tradition of political correspondence. They were all at Westminster. What we had, parliamentary correspondence, they'd all been at Westminster. What we had was a political journalist, which was all about the, personalities and all the rest. So I'd be curious to know if you think we've moved on from that 10 years, 25 years now, with a new generation of journalists. But my question was really for Adam, because somebody said, I was discussing this morning the fact that the Labour Party has a weird position because 30% of Labour voters were in favour of independence. I realise I've never heard a similar statistic about the Conservative Party, but I have to assume there are Conservative voters who are in favour of independence. And how do unionist parties manage that when Labour in particular take such a firm line? They say they won't even allow Scotland the right to have a referendum, far less allow their members to be in favour of independence. So I'm curious to know if you know what the Conservative equivalent position is.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I can do the politician thing of answering a different question, which is to say that the most effective Conservative politician in Scotland is not in the Conservative Party. She's the Deputy First Minister. and Conservatives will see. No, she is. There's an opportunity coming, right, which will test some of the aspirations that we all have shared on the panel tonight. We're now back in a situation where we have a parliament of minorities, which is the same as it was when Jean and I were serving in the Scottish Parliament. It was a parliament of minorities. No one party had an overall majority. So in order to get anything done, much as Charlie describes in Glasgow City Council, in order to get anything done, you had, by definition, to be prepared and willing to work with others. We're now back to that situation where we have a parliament of minorities in Holyrood, and we have an embattled finance secretary who is about to introduce a budget into the Scottish Parliament. And if that budget doesn't pass, as I understand it, there's going to have to be an early election. Now, wouldn't it be interesting to see a party other than the Greens support the budget? Because the reason why there's been no party other than the Greens supporting the budget for the last however many years it's been now, 8 or 9 years, is because even the question of the budget is refracted through the goddamn constitutional prism. And wouldn't it be nice to see a finance secretary prepared to talk to parties other than the Greens about what might be in the budget in order to get it passed, and two, some ostensibly unionist opposition parties prepared to talk to the finance secretary about how expensive their votes would be to get the budget through. That would be a test, wouldn't it, of the things that we've been talking about. My friends, don't hold your breath.
Jonathan, sorry, could you just let us know, introduce?
There's a really interesting debate to be had here on the issue of class. The referendum engaged working class people in Scotland in a way that we've never seen before. You obviously said that working class people don't tend to turn out to vote in vast numbers, and the referendum encouraged people to do that. Personally, I think Better Together othered working class people in a way that the Yes campaign didn't. I felt empowered by the Yes campaign personally, and I felt that Better Together othered working class people in a probably similar way to the way that Westminster others working class people and makes you feel sort of not included and like your voice doesn't matter. And I would just be interested to hear the panel's point of view on the issue of class.
We'll come to that in a minute. I think we'll just have a couple more questions if that's great. I've got Tom Harris up there, former Labour MP for, was it Glasgow Cathcart at the time? Sorry, apologies.
Thanks for outing me, Eddie. Former MP, resigned from, retired through public demand, I suppose the best way of putting it. Yes, I know my successor as the ex-MP for Glasgow South is also here. Following on from that the last comment, I mean, I am absolutely 100% down with favouring a political agenda that is class-based. I think it's far more important for public policy than any other consideration, whether that's sex or race, nationality. Class politics is where it's at. I disagree that Better Together othered working class voters. But where I think the criticism of Better Together was accurate is that, we started the campaign on the defensive and spent 2.5 years on the defensive for the very simple reason that we were being asked to defend a status quo. And although the polls started off at 70-30 in favour of the union, those polls we knew they were going to change, and they were only going to change in one direction. So of course we were on the defensive the whole time. I'm part of that half of the nation that looks back on those 2.5 years with not a single fond memory. For me, it was certainly not a joyous celebration of democracy. It was hellish. I worked so hard with my local. I wasn't involved in the national campaign. I was involved in Glasgow South, and I don't recall a single canvassing session. And we did 3 per day by the end of the campaign. I don't remember a single canvassing session where we did not endure aggressive heckling or insults from yes campaigners. Now, I'm sorry if that doesn't fit in with the joyous civic nationalism that we're supposed to believe in. That was just my experience. And as Adam says, that has to be acknowledged. And I hate the way this country has been divided in the last 10 years. And it really just confirms to me a view that I've expressed a number of times. A referendum on a constitutional issue should only be held, as it was in 1997, to confirm what is already understood to be the settled will of the people. Where you have a referendum where there isn't a settled will, where there isn't already a consensus, you're basically firing the starting gun, and both sides are rushing to 50% of the vote plus one. Can you imagine a worse start for independent Scotland than an independent Scotland secured on 50% of the votes of Scotland? It would have been a disaster for the country. Irrespective of whatever policies were pursued, we would have started with a terrible, awful, divided country. And that's what we got for the last 10 years. And I just think, the villain of the piece is not Alex Salmond. To me, Alex Salmond, whatever you may think of him, was a political genius. To me, the villain of the piece was David Cameron, a man who just didn't understand politics, was out of his depth in number 10, and who, hours after the No campaign won, betrayed the entire coalition of Better Together by revealing his tendency, as I said at the time, it's the story of the scorpion and the frog. It's just what they do. They screwed us on the last morning of the referendum campaign, and the consequences of that, plus the bitter divisions that were caused by a referendum that didn't start out with a consensus, we're still suffering from that. And it's only because, and forgive me, Stuart, but it's only because I've got closure now that I feel I can actually come along to the very best and talk about it. But that's a long time to have to wait for us to get back to some kind of political normality. And I just hope we don't have to suffer that.
Having had one former MP for Glasgow South, I feel like we should have the other one. But whether you want to come in straight away, I'm going to ask the lady behind you. Libby, I think, yeah, we'll have the lady behind you first. And then...
I was just really curious to ask the panel sort of how immovable you feel that entrenchment, those binary positions that particularly, I guess you've been speaking about yourself, Eddie, are, because I feel I'm a journalist, so I have the privilege of kind of going around Scotland asking normal people who don't come to events like this what they think. And what I've noticed particularly in the last 18 months is I think there is a little bit more room in people's positions that that kind of holding on to yes or no as your kind of absolute identity has loosened a bit. Started off, I think, I noticed it in Rutherglen, that by-election particularly, and that sort of decoupling that Jean was speaking about of support for the SNP with support for independence, I think has really impacted that. But what I have then noticed sort of particularly, I mean, this isn't going to surprise anybody, sort of going around and speaking to folk during the general election earlier this year, is just how completely disenfranchised and disappointed and distanced from politics. So many people feel, and that's, that obviously kind of should body all of us.
Yes, we'll come to that. We've got some more hands being raised, so I think we'll just do maybe a couple more, and then I'll ask the panel to maybe pick up on anything that they've heard. Yes, man with the banana T-shirt. Is it banana? It's macaroni. Sorry. With specs on.
I think I'm on. So the previous person who spoke talks about disenfranchisement, and I think that's quite key for why there's been a degree of alienation. In the run-up to the 21 Holyrood election, Colin Mackay chaired a leaders' debate, and he said to Anna Sarwar, if the Scottish people want a referendum on independence, how do they vote for it? And Sarwar said, well, they're just about to vote for it, with the implication that a majority in the Scottish Parliament would be sufficient to call a referendum. I also agree with Tom, which is an unusual experience for me, that no sensible pro-independence government would do that, starting at a second time, starting at 50% or starting at 45%. I also think that the no side should be more confident about that. There's an enormous opportunity for a yes-minded government to put the ball into their own net by calling a second referendum when the public aren't into it, and then we would hear no more of it ever again, like Quebec. But I do feel the no side must answer the question, like, how do we get even a vote if we want it democratically? We can't. The yes side can't win a UK majority. Thank you.
I'll train us, and then just to spare Ross keep running around, we'll go to the gentleman right next to you.
I want to start with the word however. I'm an independence activist. However, I want to share company with Mr. Tompkins, who wrote an article in the Herald, I've got it with me, in November 2022, which is headed, "The Supreme Court ruling is good news for nationalists." I agree with you. It's quite clear in the article, I'll be very brief, Mr. Chair, I promise. In the article, the question is raised as whether or not a referendum on a one-day, one-issue, non-self-executing is the way to decide the future of a country. Most people in this audience, I would imagine, would share my view. That's why Brexit is a disaster. But it leaves us with a problem if there's no referendum. You go on, Adam, to refer to the settled will, as did an earlier speaker. We've got a major problem with that, because you're going to have to find a way, absent a referendum, of establishing what the settled will of the Scottish people is. So I leave the panel with that question. How, perhaps legally, perhaps even just satisfactorily, do you establish the settled will of the Scottish people as to the future of their country?
Sorry, Adam.
I mean, let me have a stab at answering that, right? I suspect that there's nobody on the panel, and I hope that there's nobody even in the room who would dissent from the view that the sovereign decision maker here is the people of Scotland. It is up to I'm a unionist, right? I want the sovereign will of the people of Scotland to be that we should stay in the union. But I might win that, I might lose that. To quote myself, I don't give a shit really. In the sense that what really matters is that we agree on who's the decision maker. And I think that one of the good things about the referendum was that we did all agree on who the decision maker should be. It wasn't a UK-wide vote. It wasn't a parliamentary vote. It wasn't a vote of all people who claimed to be Scottish in the world. It was a people of all the people. It was a vote of all the people who were on the franchise here in Scotland on the relevant day. Okay, so that's the starting point. We all agree that it's the settled will of the sovereign people of Scotland who get to determine Scotland's constitutional future. I think that it's inconceivable that there could ever be independence without a referendum, but I also think that it is extremely unlikely that any second referendum would look anything like the first one, for the reasons that Tom Harris gave. The Indie-Ref and the Brexit referendum were both failures. They were failures because they failed to settle the question that was put. And the reason why they failed to settle the question that was put is because they were both put prematurely. right? What we need to do first is to figure out that it is the view of Scotland that we want to be independent. Sorry, Danny. And that we want to, we have an idea about what that independence will look like. Not necessarily a complete plan, not necessarily a written constitution, but a coherent idea about, are we in the European Union or not? What's the currency? What do we do about fast lane? What do we do about, how does the breakup of the United Kingdom look? All of that work needs to be done not after we ask the people of Scotland whether it's something that they might want to sign up to, but before we ask them that. And I actually think that's quite likely to happen. I think it's quite likely to happen that over the course of the next 20 years or so, the conversation in Scotland will gradually move on to the issue of, what kind of nation do we want to be? In the short term, how do we want to fix the health service and improve the roads? In the longer term, some of the questions I've just been talking about. And during the course of that conversation, the settled will we all knew in 1997 that it was the settled will of the Scottish people for devolution. We all knew, right? And at some point, we will get to the point where we all know that the settled will of the Scottish people is either to pursue independence or not.
I kind of agree with you. I have to say, I know it's a completely inadequate answer because it doesn't say there is a hard and fast rule in some ways, but it's almost we'll know when we know.
Yes,
that there is a kind of sense that this combination of, is it long enough since the last one? Is there kind of popular support for it? Is there a kind of clear kind of feeling, as there was prior to devolution, that people want to put this now to the test? Are the kind of combination of factors, it seems to me, that would say, right, okay, well, let's have a referendum. And it's not, I accept it's not a kind of, it doesn't kind of meet democratic test, if you like. Jean, sorry, you wanted to come in, John.
So I agree with a lot of what Adam has said, although I'd quite like it to be quicker than 20 years. Given my advancing years, Adam, I'd like to be around to see it. But I think we shouldn't be misty-eyed about 97 and what led up to 97. So people have a tendency to say, well, 97, we knew it was a settled will, as if that kind of suddenly emerged as if by magic. It was the product of much disputatious argument, disagreement, machinations, all sorts of carryings on. That's how it happened. And there was lots of large discussions, big discussions, behind the scenes discussions, all sorts of things going on over a period. So if that is reasonably what we're saying, that's what we should be focused on, is those kinds of conversations and discussions. Fair enough. I do tend to agree that a referendum only really makes sense when you more or less have settled the question. And I absolutely agree that if you want people to vote for a different position to the one that they're in now, i.e. you want them to leave a union that no matter what they think of it, they still know it and they've been in it for a while, you need to give them some pretty damn clear idea about what this new thing could look like and their role in that new thing, then fine. But let's not pretend that 97 just emerged out of the ether and everyone woke up one day and said it is the settled will of the Scottish people. It didn't work like that, and it didn't work without deals and disagreements, and some of which were unpleasant. And the last thing I'd say is, let's also be really careful not to believe that any toxicity that existed around the referendum campaign existed in the experience of only one group of people. Trust me, it didn't, all right? And that will happen when there is a binary question like that and people will jump to one side or the other. That doesn't mean we all need to follow that behaviour. And that applies right now as much as it did then.
Jonathan? Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can learn from Brexit and the process around Brexit. I'm in a minority in terms of views around independence in Europe. I'm much more critical of the European Union, for example. But leaving that argument to one side, What Brexit did was introduced different concepts. And one of those concepts was a hard Brexit and a soft Brexit. Now, these kinds of things would emerge, I think, after a yes vote in 2014. In other words, it's not just that a referendum might be a difficult way of deciding independence or not, but that the meaning of independence or the meaning of Brexit itself is contested, even within the camp that nominally supports either one of these ideas. So there's another layer of complexity there. You also have to, I think, consider that once you have the vote to leave, there is then, quite quickly after, a broad-ranging campaign for another referendum on the question. Now, again, you could imagine a similar scenario in Scotland if the vote was closely won by the yes side. But critically, the SNP signed up to that agenda. They signed up for a people's vote. And Pete Wishart, not someone who, by the way, I disagree, I agree with on many things, but he did make a very important point. That was, well, if you're going to do that around Brexit, you can't credibly argue that there shouldn't be some kind of confirmatory vote after a successful vote for independence. So I'm just coming to the view that constitutional questions at one level are very, very difficult to resolve. They're contested intellectually as to what they actually mean. And the idea that there is a lasting solution to any of these questions, I think, is very difficult to conceive of. Look at Brexit and United Kingdom's relationship with the EU. I mean, actually, that's an evolving negotiation. The negotiations happen every day and every week. That will change, that will evolve over time. I think it will converge more rather than diverge. That's not what we're seeing from Keir Starmer just now, but I think that is, generally speaking, the direction of travel. So we have to go back, I think, and this, again, is from my own political perspective, being on the left to what you were saying, which is we have to go back to some questions about class, about power, about, as I say, democracy, as it currently exists, and think to ourselves, we have a society which, you know, if you look at society, actually, in lots of ways, it's falling apart at the seams. There are huge disputes inside it. There are major problems. You know, people have been hit with, you know, a decade of austerity or longer, and the cost of living crisis, and there is a dearth of hope. And when there is a dearth of hope, then people will go in all sorts of directions. And some of those directions, I think, are very difficult to tackle once they get in the bloodstream. You know, blaming other people, you know, punching down, rather than actually saying we have an economic system which needs to be debated, needs to be challenged through. And that's the kind of discussion that I would like to have in Scotland right now, about where we go on that basis and understand the nuance in these constitutional dynamics. Danny, you'd like to have it?
But yeah, so I'd kind of like to build a bit on what Jonathan was saying, but also on what Libby was saying earlier. So this general election, instead of going around lots of different constituencies, I kind of did a deep dive on one particular constituency. And so I was following voters from, you know, through the process of the election. And what I noticed that definitely wouldn't have happened in 2015 was that some of those voters were shifting several times within that space of those 6 weeks from SNP to Labour to SNP to Labour. And that's got to mean something. It's got to mean that the constitutional question is not surely at the foremost of their, you know, their priorities. They may retain the same position on independence, but their priorities are not constitutional. And surely, I mean, I'd be interested in what the other panels think. Surely the individual parties have to respond to that in some way, and that will. And there was, you know, the parties were still talking about independence, but not a single person that I spoke to and about was talking about independence as their priority, you know, and certainly not a referendum. So that's got to make a difference in how parties respond, I would have thought.
I'm going to have a quick last go around the room, and then I'll ask everybody just to quickly sum up with a kind of just a view of, you know, where I started, which was, you know, this, one of the things we're trying to do at the John Smith Centre is make this case for kind of a better politics. And I'd like you to sum up, if you wouldn't mind, at the end, how you think we could, within this constitutional debate, try out a better politics than the one we've done over the last 10 years. But let me just go 3 or 4 points to the room first. Again, sorry. All right.
Click. I've just suddenly realised, and it's back to your point, Jean, about this, and Adam's, about the settled will. I think what people in this room are probably, many of them, too young to know, is that we lost a referendum for a parliament in 79, and a campaign was launched in 79-80 called the Campaign for a Scottish Assembly, became the Parliament. Out of that came the Convention and 10 years of convention work got us to the 97 referendum. I can tell you, it didn't feel like they settled well in the EICC the night of the count. We weren't convinced, but we won outstandingly. But it was about one single campaign with one clear purpose. And when I was selling that scheme or explaining that scheme around the country, what always surprised me was the number of people that said, my heart wanted to say yes, my head said no, but I had no idea you had a scheme already worked out. And I think that's your point.
Sorry, would you mind running up to the top? The chat right in the back, and we haven't served the back properly yet. So just on the right-hand side there. Yep, there we go.
Thank you, Andy Mac. What I want to say to you is, talk to, was it Danny was saying about the last election and about how people spot me SNP to Labour. I noticed on Facebook and that, but I feel it was a different election. It was more, get the Tories out, any about the Tories. Lib Dems a second, I'll vote Lib Dem. SNP a second, I'll vote SNP. It was to lock the Tories out, because they knew it was chaos. They saw Partygate, they saw the gambling gate, they saw law breaking, they saw down the street with all the PPE for COVID going in the bin. And it was just more like, I think I worked out £65 billion of wasted during COVID. And it wasn't just like, oh, SNP, oh, I wouldn't yes. I know yes voters have voted Labour,
yeah,
just to get the Tories out. And I don't think Labour can say, well, he lost the election, adios, independence.
Yeah, super.
That was not, I remember in 2011, Margaret Cowan was saying, I'm sure Margaret Cowan was on, show this panel, I know that, it was when John Mason won his seat. And he said how people vote in the Scottish election and Westminster is different. I think we're going back to 2007, round about then, where people voted Labour at Westminster to lock the Tories out, because we know it's only going to be Tory Labour. We know SNP can't win Westminster. Lib Dems, well, they don't win elections, so you can't win.
Okay.
The bare polls go. And so it's Tory Labour.
Yeah.
And we see where Tories won in England, they then vote SNP for Scotland. So I think it'll be quite crucial for next election. Depends how bad Labour do, and I think it'll do pretty bad. All the tanks in the poll, but at 4 points. There's only 4 points between Labour and Tories, the last poll I looked at. I think the SNP will do, I don't think it'll be a pro-independence majority government,
yeah.
But what I do think it'll be like 07, where SNP, I don't think it'll be one seat by 40 odd votes, but I think it'll be a handful of seats more SNP before Labour, and I think it'll be a minority.
Thanks very much. Sorry, we've only got like 10 minutes left, so can I we're going to try and get 3 more people, we can keep it really brief yet. The lady just behind Tom here. We just keep them brief so we can get as many people in as possible.
Thanks very much. It's a really interesting discussion. I suppose I'm coming at it from, I voted in 97 and 2014, but I don't have a fixed position. My position's a wee bit contingent, and it's a wee bit contingent on what happens in the rest of the UK and things like the quality of democracy we have and participation that we have in other parts of the systems within the UK. And I suppose I think that I'm seeing signs that in some ways with the SNP dominance slipping a bit, and I think it was interesting what you're saying, Jonathan, about like the people joining the SNP for agency. I actually think they kind of held the SNP hostage in some ways, because the SNP leadership had to constantly respond to those people demanding another referendum, now 5 years, whatever. Anyway, but as that dominance sort of slips a wee bit, and there's the Labour government now down south, and they're making kind of some very small gestures towards a better relationship, about more collaboration. I think there's talk about, they have something in the manifesto around a kind of foreign policy council, which would have representatives from all the different nations. And there's greater devolution down south. They're talking about more mayors. They're talking about more like local combined authorities, mainly in pursuit of the economic growth agenda. And I just wonder what panel sort of thinks about these kinds of changing landscapes and whether that what's happening in the rest of the UK will then have an impact upon kind of constitutional issues here.
Thanks. I'm afraid I think what the panel thinks is going to have to wait for another event, but anyway. Gentleman right at the back there, with your hand up. There, just to your right. Yep, keep going. He's got his hand up. I can see him. Just, yes.
I'm going to come back slightly to a point Jean made earlier about young people's support for independence. So I was 8 at the time of the referendum. And you might think an 8-year-old cognitively or educated is not going to be into politics. I probably realised that I am slightly atypical in that I was interested at the age of 8. But a lot of my friends were too, and that is, I mean, I went along, I saw a local debate, I think it was Douglas Alexander, people from both sides chat about it, and as an 8-year-old, I mean, no one was asking me, but I made up my mind. I made up my mind on the constitutional question. No one was asking me, but yeah, I decided. And then since then, some young people haven't been, I think there's a rough division between, I mean, as you said, the majority of young people support independence. That is my experience. But equally, they are, I don't want to say soft yes voters. Some of them have had that opinion, like at my age group, since they were 8, that they support independence. But now, the question of independence, when you're discussing it with young people, it's become, as you say, the sort of division. You've got yes or no young people, and then you've got people who never made up their mind, and you don't talk about it with a new person because you feel like you're going to fall out with people over that question. And that has been, the past 10 years.
That's interesting that that's still there. Right, I'm afraid we're gonna have to kind of very quickly sum up. So in a sentence is your challenge. In a sentence, right? How do we do this better over the next 10 years? We talked tonight about, the more curiosity about the other side and at least taking on those views, if not compromising over them. But let me go to Adam, the great compromise, the great conciliator.
So I think, notwithstanding all of the really great stuff we've heard about bottom-up grassroots politics, I think it has to come from the Scottish Parliament. I think the Scottish Parliament has to lead the way. After the next election, there will be a Parliament of minorities, and I would like to see cooperation and collaboration, perhaps even coalition between parties that is not defined by the Constitution. The SNP and the Greens are not a very good fit. The only reason why they go together is because they agree on the Constitution. Labour and the SNP would be a much more interesting fit. It's not what I want, but in a sense, I think it might be a sort of test for whether we can do better.
Who wants to go next?
So I think the Parliament has a role, but I don't think it is down to the Parliament. I think it is down to politicians, regardless of party, beginning to talk to each other about how we make the country better without using the word constitution. Just park that somewhere. That becomes a means to an end as opposed to the end in and of itself. And every time we talk about the constitution debate, we make it an end in itself. It is not an end in itself. You either think it is a means to improve the end, or you think you don't need it. But you need to have the conversation to see. So I personally would just kind of park that word over there and talk about, from now, starting tomorrow, what are the things that we collectively agree need to be done, that we want our politicians to focus on to make people's lives better, fairer, and maintain and improve the democracy that we have.
If I could add my view, because I agree with you, I think the focus on the economy, for me, which is not a word we've spoken about an awful lot this evening. I mean, I noticed in a poll today in YouGov, when people were told, would you back independence if it damaged the cost of living or your standard of living, it goes down to like 25%. If you're going to get, well, of course, but if you're going to get independence, you've got to demonstrate that there is a sense of, that this is the risk factor around the economy is going to have to be, if not eradicated, at least lessened. So my view would be focus on a strategy that goes on for 10 years.
Yeah, and can we
across parties?
Daft questions like that. That's a bit like saying if you vote for independence, it'll damage your granny. Do you want to do it?
Well, I think
come on,
it's your problem. I think it's the problem that you've got, which is that economic risk was the key factor as to why people didn't vote for independence. No, it's exactly. It's a collective. Totally agree. So why not see something that is joined together? Anybody else?
I mean, I've always believed that the way to get independence was to demonstrate competent governance. I've heard June talk about this a lot. You know, if people believe that Scotland if people can see evidence that Scotland can be governed well, then they're more likely to vote for independence. But the best thing about concentrating on that is it's better for Scotland anyway. So whether or not you get independence at the end of it, it's a win-win.
Jonathan, sum up for us.
Very briefly, there isn't a natural, or if you like, a cultural majority for independence in Scotland. And that makes it quite different from other movements for national independence historically. That there is always some proximate reason that has to be made or articulated in order to boost or lower support for independence, economic strength or whatever else it might be. And that's why when you've had these big events like Brexit or Boris Johnson, any of these types of things, actually the polls show a pretty paralysed state of affairs. Like, it hasn't led to this big surge. And that's because the case as a standalone case is quite confused. And it is a confusing thing to make, but that's the complexity there. My last point is that, see, I start from a slightly different position in the sense that I'm looking less towards politicians and parliaments and more towards movements of people, trade unions and other forms of social movement, which I think have to make their presence known in Scottish politics. I think they will over the next few years, and I'll just end by thanking Eddie very much for the event.
So let me just quickly sum up. I think what we think at the hope at the John Smith Centre, as I said at the start, is that by having more discussions like this, listening and learning from each other, that you end up making better decisions, and that from that comes a better politics. And in this case, we hope a better Scotland, whether we're in or out of the UK. Can I just thank on your behalf all of the panel for all of their very thoughtful comments tonight. It's a bit of a leap of faith taking a part in an event like this. So I'm very, very grateful to all four of you for being so thoughtful and reflective. And can I also thank all of the audience here as well for all of the comments that you've given us. And I hope you found this interesting and enlightening too. We have more events coming up. We've got an event on after the US elections in November, which we thought we'd tackle the non-controversial issues, I can also let you know that next week at the University of Glasgow, the Centre for Public Policy is coming up with more detailed kind of policy ideas around this very issue. Is there some way forward that you could satisfy both sides? Let's see how that goes down. But I believe that's coming out next week, and already there is a podcast out